Good morning. I am delighted to be here, and thank you, Brian, for that kind introduction. Thanks to the Marquette Associates team for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for being here. So this symposium brings us together to discuss the current market, emerging investment themes, and how to become better investment stewards. I've been asked to set the stage, and my goal is also to stretch your minds. So over the next hour, we're going to focus less on where the economy is headed with regards to GDP and interest rates. That comes later. And rather, look at new business models that fundamentally change how people and organizations meet their needs, which in turn affects everything else. You may have heard about the digital sharing economy. That's where we'll start, with what it is, why it matters, what's happening here in the US and around the world, and what's on the horizon. I'm going to share examples with you from many different industries, and also connect this to other themes that we'll talk about in the course of today. As we do this, I'd like to ask you to please keep in mind what this means for you both professionally, in your role as an investor, advisor, or executive, and also what this might mean for you personally, in your role as a parent, a neighbor, a member of your community. So we have a lot to cover. Let's get started. Also, I was asked to mention there are cards on your tables. We're going to have about 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. If you have questions as I'm going along, please write them down on the cards, and someone will be coming around to pick those up to facilitate the Q&A at the end. So just a housekeeping footnote as we get started. So first, let's get a little bit of context and grounding as to how we got to today. Okay, take a look at these photos. We see a card catalog to find books and information, the yellow pages to find people and companies, a Walkman to listen to music, and a community notice board to find everything from housing to childcare or a ladder to borrow. Who here remembers using these things? Yeah, right, yeah. Think about it though. All of these functions have disappeared. They've been eaten by new technologies, while a whole new world of connectivity has risen up. Moreover, what used to be physical is now digital or electronic, and getting the same things done often takes far fewer resources. So, Google search replaces my yellow pages and then some. Wikipedia replaces my card catalog, Spotify replaces my Walkman, and eBay blows away the community notice board. Now, these changes didn't happen overnight. They were gradual over many years and the result of many factors. A lot of what we're talking about can be traced to the emergence of the internet, which allowed us to connect with more people in more ways and share more things than ever before. So going way back, we started by sharing bits of information, an email. Then we started sharing news and photos, and then music and files, and then we started sharing our cars. And now we can share a whole range of physical assets as well as expertise and experiences. Against that backdrop, pause and think about what you can do today with access to the internet and the phone in your hand. You can find pretty much everything. All kinds of information, your next job, your next vacation, even your next date. Now, imagine it is expected that by 2020, which feels bizarre, that's kind of only 2 years from now. By 2020, it is expected that 90% of the global population over age 6 will have a mobile phone, and the majority of people alive in the world will not know or remember a world in which they couldn't find everything through their phone. So the power and potential that this kind of connectivity unleashes is unparalleled. And it will transform how we think about business and how we think about investing. But it will also transform how we live our lives, how we raise our families, and the kind of future that we build. So one of the more interesting results of this newfound connectivity is the rise of today's digital sharing economy. An economy that's based on access over ownership and decentralized networks of people connected through new technologies. And I'm going to take a few minutes to go through what's driving the sharing economy, because especially for those of you who are new to the concept, I want to provide everyone with a framework to see what's going on so that moving forward, you have a common terminology, but also a common frame of reference. At its core, it's driven by 3 principles: resource utilization, decentralization, and relationships. So, in turn, the first principle, resource utilization, is easy to get your head around. It basically means how much we use the things we have. So how many of you have a car that's parked right now in a garage, parking lot, on the street? Don't be embarrassed. Okay, right. So on average, the typical car sits parked and unused 23 hours a day. That is a 95% inefficient resource. That's underutilization. Once you start looking for underutilization, you find it everywhere. Buildings that sit empty most of the time. Toys that you buy for your kids and they quickly outgrow and you stash them in the closet. Appliances that you only use a couple times a year. When we have to own all this stuff and yet use it really infrequently, not only is it inefficient, it's also expensive. We can do better than this. Now think not only about those things that you need, like a car, but things that you enjoy doing from time to time. Boats are a great example. A lot of people love the water, but don't have a boat. Globally, boats are about 10% efficient. 90% of the time, they're docked, collecting barnacles and costing the owner money to maintain. So in this case, it's not just a waste of resources, but also a lot of enjoyment left on the table. Now, imagine, what if you could access a boat when you wanted it? And not just one boat. What if you could access a whole range of boats? We've got sailboats, speedboats, my favorite, this shoe-shaped boat, or a yacht, right? Any kind of boat, depending on your needs. Think about what this changes for people who own boats and those who don't. It costs less and defrays the cost of maintenance. It gives you greater choice and convenience. It allows more people to do the things they love, and it's even better for the environment. We're using resources more sustainably, more efficiently. And it's not just boats. Think about all of those things you love doing from time to time and the new ways you might enjoy them. So that's the first principle. The second principle is decentralization. As I said, we are experiencing a sea change in connectivity. I can connect with more people in more ways than ever before. Prior to the sharing economy, companies typically held centralized inventory, which they would then sell or rent out to everyone else. But today, thanks to these new technologies, we're looking at a new universe of decentralized inventory, things owned by people like you and me that we can now put into better use directly with one another, in effect matching needs and haves or supply and demand more efficiently. So, I can find accommodation without a hotel, I can find a ride without a taxi dispatcher, and I can run errands without a store. This is a fundamentally different allocation of resources than in traditional markets. Production, consumption, ownership, and power are all to some degree decentralized. And the value resides in the network itself, not in any particular piece of it. And the final principle driving the sharing economy is the one closest to my heart, relationships. Think about the last several decades and the effects of overconsumption. We've built our cities more for cars than for people. Our homes are full of things we rarely use. And sadly, for a lot of people, the sign of success, when I have my castle and my toys and you have your castle and your toys, is that we don't need to know our neighbors. And we all have seen the social problems that have resulted: isolation, loss of community, and so on. And it's not that the sharing economy solves these problems, but it does get at the core of what has gone wrong. It brings people back into relationship with one another. The vast majority of sharing requires some kind of human interaction. As we look at the sharing economy today, we see that it touches pretty much every aspect of our lives. It goes far beyond what and how we purchase. It also affects how we work, how we travel, how we learn, how we eat, how we spend and invest our money, and how we build our communities. So this slide is what I call more or less a snapshot of the sharing economy universe. There are platforms to share all of these assets and many more. Now, we don't have time to go into all of this today. I will share quite a few examples, but not all of them. What I want to underscore is the breadth and depth and scope and diversity of what's going on. And keep in mind that all of the platforms and companies to share all of these assets are driven by the same three principles: resource utilization, decentralization, and relationships. So in other words, it's all connected. Now, from a numbers perspective, for a group of at least many investors, it's hard to deny the sharing economy's explosive growth. As a recent PwC report said, it's getting very, very big very fast. Now, just how big and how fast depends on how much you include and where you look, but the overall conclusion is the same. From an investment perspective, in 2013, $3.5 billion in venture funding was invested in sharing economy companies. By last year, that was over $30 billion, and it's expected that sharing economy companies will generate revenues in excess of $335 billion by 2025. In terms of efficiency and scale, lots of examples I can point to here. A couple of particularly compelling ones. Airbnb, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. In 8 years, they have more rooms available than all major hotel brands combined, and they operate in more than double the number of countries of any of them. And BlaBlaCar, which is a French ride-sharing company, we'll talk about that in a minute as well. BlaBlaCar transports 4 times as many people as the entire Eurostar train network every day, and they do so at less than 1% of the cost of capital. Now, any way that we slice these numbers, what we also see is that local economies are getting a boost. And that makes sense because sharing as an activity is a hyper-local activity, and we're sharing assets that are all around us, in our neighborhoods and in our communities. Why might you share rather than own some of the things that you need to live your life? As we look at this space and how it's growing, what we've seen is that the benefits generally fall into 4 categories. So first, economic benefits. Sharing rather than owning or accessing rather than owning saves money, costs less, allows you to earn income in new ways, create a more affordable lifestyle. Second, environmental benefits. Sharing rather than owning, no question, uses resources more sustainably. Third, community benefits, the relationships and social capital I was talking about earlier. And finally, practical benefits, choice, convenience, flexibility, that sort of thing. I spend a lot of my time poking holes in these business models and trying to figure out what's going to make this run off the rails. And it's not a panacea, and it's not going to overtake ownership overnight, and it's not ever going to fully overtake ownership at all. And it has to be harnessed responsibly, which we'll talk about more in a bit as well. But the fact remains, I cannot find any other business model that has this many benefits packed into it at once, and you get them all simultaneously, whether or not you want them. So you might want to do this because you want to save money. Turns out you're doing something green. You might want to do something green. Turns out you're building community. It's a very, very compelling proposition when you look at it in this lens. A brief word on who is participating, and this is because one of the questions I'm asked most commonly is, or most often is, isn't the sharing economy just for millennials and hipsters? The answer is no. It is true that younger generations are huge adopters of this space, but what we're seeing is greater participation and growth across the board. For example, the elderly are one of the biggest growth cohorts in the sharing economy. And that makes sense. They might be empty nesters. They might have collected a few more things than they actually need. They might be lonely. These are all wonderful characteristics for the sharing economy. We find that families, anyone connected to a kid, loves the sharing economy. Who wouldn't? You don't have to keep buying and owning, replacing things as your kids are growing. That means that women do like the sharing economy as well, but beyond their role as mothers and so forth, women as a demographic, huge adopters of the sharing economy. We find low income increasingly participating, and this makes sense because you might be able to access something that you couldn't otherwise afford. For example, a family that struggles to own a car may be able to afford a monthly car sharing membership, which in turn opens up new job opportunities, extracurricular activities, and so on. And finally, we find that business-based sharing, B2B, enterprise sharing around supply chain, back-end operations, and so forth, is a significant growth category. It's currently one of the smaller pieces of the pie, but one that's growing fastest, and certainly when it comes to things like environmental impact, can make a huge difference. Now, I always have to give the caveat that I'm not here to convince or convert you to the sharing economy, not at all. what I want to do is sort of spell out this menu of options that people and organizations now have to meet their needs, and also show you how many different people, many different demographics can meet many different needs in these new ways. Coming back to youth, though, it is important to understand that insofar as youth are big adopters of this, and they will be tomorrow's workers and leaders and customers, it's really important to understand how they're behaving today. Finally, thank you for your patience. We're about to dive into a bunch of examples, but I really want to give you this framework. One final word on terminology, because as the sharing economy has grown, some people have charged that it's not really sharing, and they're partly right. So it is true that the sharing economy is a broad umbrella term, more or less. And on the one hand, there are lots of companies and platforms that espouse the true spirit of sharing, underutilized resources, building community, and so on. There's also some of what I call share washing going on. Companies latching onto the term because it sounds good. So there's a growing list of terms attempting to define this space, including those that are listed here. All of these terms are partially valid. Many of them overlap, and none of them is perfect. But what I want to underscore is that regardless of what we call these new business models, they're taking root. And whether and how we adapt will fundamentally determine our success and our well-being moving forward. With that, thank you for your patience. Now we come to, hopefully that was interesting. Now it gets fun. So we're going to look at what's happening around the world. To do this, again, trying to give you guys handy frameworks and tools that you can take away easily, we're going to use a little framework. It's nothing too fancy. I didn't invent it, but it's a helpful way to remember what comprises the sharing economy. It's called the 3 S's, for the 3 categories of assets that are most commonly shared in the sharing economy. The first S is space. So think about all the different kinds of space that's underutilized. Not just our homes, office space, commercial space, retail space, green space, parking space, the list goes on. We're going to start easy here with a company that I'm assuming many of you, if not almost all of you, have heard of, other than me mentioning it earlier. I'm not going to focus on it because it's particularly new, but it's a jumping off point. So Airbnb. Who here has not heard of Airbnb? That is amazing right there. So I've been working in this space for many, many years. 3 years ago, 5 years ago, it would have been mostly glazed eyes. So that alone is interesting. Very briefly, Airbnb was founded in 2008 by these 3 young men who had recently graduated from college. They were living in San Francisco and struggling to afford rent. At the time, there was a convention in town, not enough hotel rooms to go around, and they thought, what if we put an airbed down in our living room, charge people to stay with us, showed them our favorite sites around town, and they'd help us make rent. Turned out a lot of people were interested, and they ended up hosting 3 different people over the course of that week. Very different people, one from the other. They had an Indian entrepreneur, a Mormon father of 5, different demographics, but they all shared a commonality in that they had a good time. And in the process, Airbnb was born. Today, Airbnb is a global online accommodation marketplace hosting over 1 million people every week in 65,000 cities in 190 countries. It's valued at $31 billion. Not bad for struggling to pay rent less than 10 years ago. Now, I'm not going to go into the model. I think many of you know how the model works. But I want to underscore a few aspects of the platform that are easy to miss and fundamentally important to its success. So first, the company owns no inventory. The space that's being shared are spaces that are owned by people like you and me. Second, they're building markets for things that never had a market before. This is not about the spare room in your house or your vacation home. You've got tree houses and teepees and igloos. The entire Principality of Liechtenstein is available on Airbnb. It's expensive, but it's there. Third, they're building community in new ways, a community that is now tens of millions of hosts and guests strong worldwide. And finally, we see a whole bunch of new enterprise creation around Airbnb. So these are companies that are being built not by Airbnb, but in the ecosystem. So things like key delivery and local concierges and experiences. In other words, it's not about Airbnb, but it's about entirely new clusters of local economic activity. So, Airbnb, tip of the iceberg. Let's look at office space, commercial space. Go back to resource underutilization. The typical office sits empty 60% of the time during workplace hours and costs $10,000 a year to maintain. Usually a company's second largest line item in their budget after salaries. At the same time, think about how many people today don't have an office in terms of they're working remotely, they're working virtually, they're freelancers. But just because you don't have your own office doesn't mean you don't need a place to work or have meetings from time to time. Enter Liquid Space. Liquid Space is a platform that matches people looking for temporary, flexible work and meeting space with people who have it. And they're tapping into all kinds of inventory, not just desks and empty offices. They've got hotel conference rooms, public libraries, media pods, all of this space that's underutilized that you can now access by the hour, by the day, or for longer periods of time. So think about it from this perspective. Liquid Space is not only at the intersection of the sharing economy, but also the future of work. They're redefining the 21st century office, and they're lowering overheads and carbon footprints in the process. Now, another example of shared space, there are lots and lots of examples that I'd love to tell you about today. We don't have time for all of them, but I want to share one more example to give you a flavor of the bigger picture. Silvernest is a platform that takes home sharing to the next level. They're not focused on travel and tourism like Airbnb, but rather on aging in place. Both Silvernest and Airbnb build community, but Silvernest is focused exclusively on older generations. Baby boomers, empty nesters, people who may need additional income in retirement, may want companionship, and definitely want the ability to continue to live in their home as the years go on. Silvernest is a platform that matches qualified homeowners who would like to share or rent out a room or portion of their home with qualified housemates. They allow you to offer reduced rent in exchange for help around the house, maintenance, that sort of thing. So think about something like this from the perspective of demographics, sustainability, and well-being. And you see how sharing economy platforms like Silvernest can be a really helpful tool if you're an elderly person, if you're an adult child with an aging parent, and of course, if you're an investor. Okay, that's the first S, space. The second S, stuff. All of those things, the cars and bikes and tools and toys and clothes and et cetera, that you need to live your life, but don't necessarily use that often. Here, there are key overlaps with the future of retail and, of course, sustainability as well. Let's start with transportation, both because that's where some of the most interesting stuff is happening these days, and also where impact can be most greatly felt. Again, think about how inefficient transportation today is. Not only does your car sit there parked 23 hours a day, it also costs on average $700 a month to maintain. And 80% of all rides taken have one person in the vehicle. This is a tremendous amount of waste. Now, we do see some interesting trends that point in a very different direction recently. For example, the percentage of millennials applying for driver's licenses in the United States is at an all-time low since the car was invented. Surveys show that 75% of 18 to 24-year-olds would rather own a smartphone than a car if they could only own one or the other. And governments around the world are busy investing in transportation solutions that see cars as a last resort. Now, we know that people everywhere will continue to need cars in some way, but how we access them, who owns them, and what a person's overall transportation picture looks like will be very different. Already today, we see a wide range of shared use transportation options available. This goes far beyond Zipcar, which was one of the earliest car sharing pioneers. Today, we have peer-to-peer car sharing, where you can share your car during the 23 hours a day you're not using it and earn income for doing so with platforms like Turo and Getaround. We have one-way car sharing with platforms like DriveNow and Car2Go. And bike sharing is the fastest growing form of transportation in the world. From a green perspective, this is really interesting and really helpful because we're consuming fewer resources. And around the world, surveys show, it varies a little bit based on where you are, but you put one car into shared use, and you take somewhere between 9 and 15 cars off the road. That is a huge win. And this impact is magnified when we factor in what's happening around autonomous and electric vehicles as well. And this is what I call the transport trifecta: shared use, autonomous, electric. And that combination will fundamentally transform our mobility landscape over the coming decade. But coming back to today, I want to use this as an example, as an opportunity to talk about one of my favorite platforms in this space, and also the globalization of the sharing economy. So I'm curious, other than my mentioning it earlier, has anyone here heard of BlaBlaCar? Oh, good. I love this. OK. So BlaBlaCar. This is a great example. Go back to this statistic that 80% of all rides have one person in the vehicle. Now, BlaBlaCar is a platform that matches people who are traveling between cities with people going the same direction with spare seats in their car. So they're a French company. If you needed to go from Paris to Amsterdam, they don't operate here in the US very deliberately, but if they did, if you needed to go from Chicago to Milwaukee, that's what we're talking about. So we've got Lyft and Uber, which operate within cities. This is to go between cities. How the model works is, let's say you need to go from Paris to Amsterdam on Sunday at 3 p.m. You post your car and you say, I'm leaving from this time, at this time, this place. I have 3 seats in my car. Other people sign up and you travel together. The economics are such that if you are the driver and your car is full, you travel for free. And each of the other passengers pays a pro rata percentage of the trip, which equates to roughly 10 to 25% of a comparable train ticket. So, no surprise, as I mentioned, they're transporting more people than the entire Eurostar train network, and they're doing so all over Europe, as well as Russia, Turkey, India, Brazil, Mexico. They have very deliberately avoided North America, but they're almost everywhere else. They are the most funded company, most funded French startup in French history, and they're currently valued at somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion. And their model is they take a small transaction fee for arranging the ride, so they're in the black from the get-go. One other brief note I want to point out here is the name. BlaBlaCar, where does it come from? So when you post your car, you get to decide, is my car a blah car? Basically, this means I want everyone to be quiet, reading a book, listening to music, like the quiet car in a train. Is it a blah blah car, which is kind of conversational? Or is it a blah 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 car, which is like chatty, kind of like the party car? Very creative from marketing. What I want to highlight here, though, is think about what I've just said about this business model. The only way that BlaBlaCar succeeds, and it's succeeding sort of hockey stick proportions, the only way it succeeds, though, is if it's boosting sustainable transport and building community. These things are in the DNA of the company. And that is a key piece of the future, not only of the sharing economy and of transportation, but of how businesses are being built in this new digital economy. Okay, now we're going to shift, that's transportation. Shift your brains, if you can, to production, design, and product development. It's a bit of a shift, but we're still on the topic of stuff. In the past, only big companies could afford the tools and technology to create new products. Innovation largely was centralized and closed within corporations, leaving a lot of people out. But today, thanks to the principles driving the sharing economy, companies like TechShop are turning that paradigm on its head. TechShop calls itself part studio, part hackerspace, part learning center. In terms of the sharing economy, we've got shared space, we have shared stuff, the tools and technology, and also shared skills. So how Tech Shop works is you become a member, and you pay a monthly membership fee, usually about $125 a month, which gives you unlimited access to top tools and technology. And I'm talking like nice technology, 3D printers, laser cutters, high-end, expensive technology that you're not likely to have at home and you're not likely going to be able to afford. They also offer classes and workshops and so forth. What Tech Shop is doing is basically creating an innovation ecosystem where innovation and product development is no longer just for companies, it's something that anyone can do. So to give you an example of this, do you guys know Square, that payment device that plugs into your laptop or mobile device? So Square went public a couple years ago at a valuation of $6 billion. Square was prototyped at Tech Shop. Not in a company research lab, at Tech Shop, by a couple of young inventors. Think about what this means, not only from the perspective of innovation, but also from an investor's perspective, and also how companies like Tech Shop could transform local economies nationwide. Finally, an example of stuff that I'm guessing some of you haven't thought about necessarily in the context of the sharing economy, healthcare. So think about how many people struggle to find access to affordable, appropriate healthcare, and how often expensive medical technology isn't used. Cohelo is a platform that enables the sharing of medical equipment as well as clinical expertise. They match patients looking for affordable, accessible, appropriate, nearby healthcare, and they help clinics and providers open new lines of services. Again, going back to resource underutilization, but also building relationships at the community level. Now, Cohelo doesn't currently share hospital space, but a lot of hospitals are very, very interested in this, and you could imagine that happening in the future. And particularly for those of you who are working in the healthcare space, I would ask you, what might the hospital of the 21st century look like from the perspective of Cohelo and the sharing economy? So many platforms we could talk about today. I'm just trying to pepper you with some examples and inspire you to learn more. We've covered space, we've covered stuff. Finally, the third S, which is skills. So this is skill sharing, talent, expertise. Admittedly, this goes beyond the sharing economy. It also bleeds into the future of work, which is where I spend a lot of my time. Today, at the least, we can begin to explore the overlaps. So as many of you know and perhaps have directly experienced, in recent years, almost every aspect of work has started to change. We've seen a shift from offices to co-working spaces. We've seen a shift from Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 schedules to all kinds of flexible and remote and independent work arrangements. And we've seen a shift from lifetime career employment to what some people call the gig economy or other kinds of flexible, independent work. New technologies are transforming how we can work together, and how we can earn income in new ways. And this is one factor behind the rise, the tremendous rise, in the number of independent workers, freelancers, and self-employed people. By freelance, I simply mean somebody without a single organizational affiliation. So this includes independent designers and consultants, but it also includes Airbnb hosts and inventors using Tech Shop. Today already, 55 million Americans, 35% of the entire workforce, is freelance. That number is expected to rise to over 50% by 2030. 70% of independent workers and freelancers opt into this. They're doing so by choice. And 90% say they will never go back to traditional employment because they're attracted by the flexibility, freedom, and control that they have. They can set their own schedules, spend more time with their families, pursue other interests. The contrast in worker autonomy is astounding. They also report being more engaged. 78% say they're happier and that they're getting more skills than they would in a traditional job. Now, we need to be clear, there are huge differences. I'm making generalizations here in terms of big differences between skilled and unskilled workers, the kinds of skills that you have, and of course, a host of outdated policies. But again, my purpose today isn't to get into that kind of debate. I want to highlight what is going on from a workplace perspective so that you all can be prepared from an investment perspective. Let's look at a couple examples of how this is playing out. So TaskRabbit, who's heard of TaskRabbit? A few people? A few people. Okay, good. That's what I would expect. TaskRabbit is a skill-sharing platform that is in the bullseye of these shifts. On TaskRabbit, they match people who are looking for a range of services and tasks to be done with people who are able to help. And this goes far beyond like running errands and doing deliveries and that sort of thing. This is specialized skills, ongoing relationships, and really fun tasks like getting paid to help somebody write a love letter. I get to spend time on these platforms looking what people are asking for. Helping somebody write a love letter. Does anyone know the most popular or most commonly requested task on TaskRabbit? Can anyone guess? Boom! Assembling IKEA furniture. That is the number one, yes. Now, I kind of wanted to share this. I kind of wanted to wait until Q&A for this, but I'm going to let the cat out of the bag because today's conference could not be better placed. Now, there are all kinds of tasks on TaskRabbit, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But guess what was announced yesterday? IKEA is purchasing TaskRabbit. But there you go. How are incumbent companies approaching? Now, I don't know what's going to happen to like electricians. Like they have all these other things. I hope that IKEA was just announced in the New York Times. So lo and behold, here we are, timely. But you know, it's interesting too to see how other kinds of companies are responding to these new ways, not just to earn income, but it's become such an important part of the IKEA supply chain at this point that they decided to integrate it into their operations outright. Going back to TaskRabbit though, in a nutshell, what TaskRabbit is able to do is think about previously these were tasks that people simply had to get done, whether they had the time or inclination or desire to do so, or things that simply didn't get done. TaskRabbit, again, creates a two-sided marketplace to match these needs and haves better. I do want to also highlight, though, who is participating. 60% of taskers are unemployed or underemployed when they sign up. And this includes a lot of people for whom traditional Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 employment isn't an option. So mothers with young children, students, retirees. TaskRabbit has been a boon for people to earn income in new ways that simply didn't exist before. You can, again, earn income, use your skills, connect with community, and do so on a schedule that works for you. And this is just a fundamentally important rethink of how people are able to create livelihoods. Now, let's take the concept of TaskRabbit and apply it to professional services, what we might think of as white-collar roles. And what we see are companies, platforms, emerging for all kinds of professional and specialized services. So we have MBAs, engineers, doctors, and so forth. And this is just a snapshot of some of my favorites. I want to give you guys ideas and resources so that you can follow up if you'd like to learn more. Catalant is focused on, on-demand MBAs. PwC has established their own talent exchange, which is for independent consultants, and so on. So this is very, very broad and very diverse. We'll look at one example in more detail, and that is legal services, because I'm guessing that many of you either know lawyers or work with them often. And think about how many lawyers, and I can say this as a former lawyer myself, like how many lawyers are sick of billing in 6-minute increments, working 100-hour weeks? And younger lawyers, at least, see that the traditional partner-led firm model isn't sustainable. They also wish they had more meaning in their work. So platforms like UpCounsel and Priori Legal tackle this problem. And what they do is they match qualified attorneys with clients who have a range of legal services, legal needs. As a lawyer, you pick what you work on, you set your schedule, and you keep the fees. UpCounsel does take a small percentage for arranging the transaction, but far less than a big firm would take as a typical matter. As a client, you have access to a much broader range of attorneys that you can engage on a more flexible basis. So this is kind of a win-win. I mean, lawyers have more connection to their work, more flexibility, and often higher earning potential. And clients have greater flexibility and often have lower legal fees as a result, all in. Okay, So we've covered space, stuff, skills. Just a brief note before we shift gears that's particularly important from an investor perspective. So I'm often asked, what are the best investment opportunities? What are the best growth areas in this sharing economy space? And I have to admit that these days I'm less focused on the platforms for the actual sharing. We're covering that space quite well, and there are lots of investment opportunities still there. But I'm looking at this more from the perspective of what I call enablers. Those services and platforms that enable more sharing, easier sharing, more responsible sharing. Payments, insurance, tax compliance, these are all classic enablers of the sharing economy. I should also call out that digital currencies like Bitcoin, they are another enabler of this space. That's a separate keynote, so I'm going to punt that to the person doing the flash talk later today, but I also would add that here as well. Let me talk about one example, just again, to give you a flavor of this bigger picture. Trove falls in the category of insurance. Trove is a platform that is rethinking risk management and providing a new way to insure. So rather than looking at comprehensive annual policies that cover everything under the sun at all times, what Trove provides is on-demand insurance for single items over very short periods of time. So think micro premiums, micro duration policies, seasonal coverage. To put this in practical use, imagine being able to insure your skis only during the winter months or only while you're on the slopes. Like, why do you pay to insure your skis 12 months a year when they just don't, you're not using them 12 months a year? Or insuring your expensive camera only when you're on vacation. That's what Trove enables. And they partner with the major insurers, State Farms and AXAs of the world, and they become the customer face for new products. This allows Trove to piggyback on the insurer's resources and customer base, and it allows the insurance companies to deliver innovative products more quickly. From this perspective, Trove can be seen not just as enabling a more responsible sharing economy, because as many of you know, most people have woefully low insurance. At the very least, we're helping people get onboarded to get appropriate access to insure the things that matter most to them. They're also helping to enable a more sustainable world. And I say sustainable from an environmental perspective, a financial perspective, and also a social perspective. Okay. Insurance is a perfect segue to talk briefly, very briefly, about one theme that no conversation about the sharing economy today is complete without, and that is policy. So a little bit of context again. As some of you may know, a lot of the rules that are on the books today were designed for an ownership era without smartphones. Like, we could not even imagine that you could build a business model through your phone. Seems kind of crazy. So as you might imagine, a lot of the rules on the books today, when we try to apply these older rules to these new business models, they break. Oftentimes, you can't even tell if they apply. Lots of gray areas, lots of challenges. This is a messy, messy space. So it doesn't mean that these old rules are bad. We designed our laws and regulations for a purpose, but it does mean that they are increasingly outdated. And there is an enormous and increasingly urgent opportunity to update them, reform them, and so forth. And governments around the world are trying to figure this out. It's early, it's messy. I do travel and work in a lot of countries, and nowhere in the world has truly figured this out. But what I like to say as well is learning how to regulate for innovation is nothing new. That's something we've been doing throughout history. And we can take some inspiration from the past. So if you think about it, the car, the ATM, the telephone, these all were considered disruptive innovations when they showed up. We were completely freaked out by them, didn't know what to do about them. Of course, not only have we figured out what to do about them, we can't imagine life without them today. So too it will go with the sharing economy, but we are still in early innings. Now, this is just a very brief list of the most common legal and policy issues that arise in the sharing economy. It's intended just as a snapshot so that you have a sense of the kinds of issues that are triggered. Some of them, like taxation, apply to a bunch of different activities. Others, like zoning, apply to a more limited set of activities. At the end of the day, and I spend a lot of my time advising companies and policymakers about these new business models, and looking at the updated regulations, they can be both very, very helpful, and at times they can be counterproductive. And what really matters is the level of awareness of policymakers, because as you might imagine, a lot of policymakers, as I'm often told, the mayor just got email. We don't know how do we regulate these sorts of things? And the gap between technology and the law is increasing. So it depends on their level of awareness, but also the attitude of incumbents and established companies, as well as, of course, the size and scale of what's going on. So this is a great time to talk again briefly about some of the globalization of the sharing economy, because as we look at what governments are doing and who's really starting to embrace or trying to embrace the sharing economy while regulating it responsibly, what I find is the most interesting stuff that's happening isn't in the United States. There's a lot that we can learn from other places. So a few examples. Perhaps surprising, but if I were to name one leader of the sharing economy from a government and public sector perspective in the world, it would be Seoul, South Korea. Go figure. They've been supporting the sharing economy since 2012. They have tackled policy reform, but also they have invested public funds in over 50 different community-led sharing economy initiatives. They've built their own sharing economy platforms as a municipality, and they've even integrated the sharing economy into school curriculum. Fascinating place to look at. In Europe, Amsterdam is one of the leaders. They have a sharing city initiative where they're trying to look at the underutilization of all city-owned resources. They have a national network of sharing cities, and the most ambitious car-sharing collaboration anywhere in the world. In the UK, it's a national leader at the global level, you could say. They have included the sharing economy in the national budget. And interestingly, they have the most sophisticated trade association for the sharing economy, which is called SEUK. And perhaps not surprising, China is quickly becoming a leader in this space as well. Back in 2015, the Chinese government declared the sharing economy a national priority, which means it ended up in their latest 5-year plan. They have said publicly they believe the sharing economy will comprise 10% of China's GDP by 2020. Nowhere else in the world has said anything close to that. So here are the points I want to make are two. One, the sharing economy isn't just about private sector innovation. There is a huge role for the public sector and public-private partnerships and so on. And secondly, that not only is the sharing economy going global, it's gone global. And there's a lot that we can learn by looking beyond our borders. So pause and think about what you've just heard. Real estate, transportation, healthcare, insurance, even cities. The sharing economy is showing up everywhere. But it's only when we look at what's happening from an ecosystem perspective that we can understand the magnitude of what it represents. Again, we can start with economics. Sharing rather than owning allows you to save money, boosts your ROA. It also enhances convenience. Then, the environment. Sharing rather than owning enables, enhances, encourages smarter stewardship of resources. But that's not all. When you put your office space or other asset into shared use, you bring other humans into the picture. You begin to increase the diversity of your ideas and your talent base. You begin to nurture new enterprises. You begin to build community, which is a new kind of asset in itself. And I call this approach layers of value. So it's not just about cost mitigation or resource consumption, but it's about creating entirely new and unexpected value and benefits to the company and everyone it touches. So this is the real innovation and the real winner, and I strongly believe this will become increasingly important to investor portfolios as well. So wrapping up and looking ahead, some people have said that we're kind of in the modern day equivalent of when the printing press was invented centuries ago. In some ways, I think it might even be more than that. And as the futurist Clay Shirky has reminded us, the printing press, when it was invented, actually led to 200 years of religious suppression first. Then it led to 200 years of warfare to sort out what was actually going on. And in the process, it transforms art, science, and civilization. And so today, on the one hand, it's true, we've opened up a kind of Pandora's box that is as big, if not bigger, than the printing press centuries ago. But on the other hand, we've also opened up a new universe of opportunity, not least for investors. And it is definitely more opportunity than threat, so long as we can rise to the occasion and sort of regrind our lenses to understand where value really resides and what people value most. And so with that, I'm simply going to end with a question, and then we'll dive into Q&A. What is, after all that you've heard me say and talk about, what is one thing that you could do today to prepare for this future that in so many ways is already here? With that, thank you very much.